Thanks for staying with us. The soon-to-be appointed Minister of Electricity could cost South Africa more than 37 million rand annually. This is according to the Democratic Alliance MP Leon Schreiber. President Cyril Ramaphosa announced yesterday during his State of the Nation address that a new ministerial post will be created in the presidency to deal with Eskom's blackouts. The former head of nuclear at Eskom, David Nicholls, joins us now to make sense of the imminent appointment. Very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. Besides the fact that it's going to cost South Africa 37 million rand a year, is a minister responsible for energy crisis a good idea?
I think it depends on how it's run. I mean, welcome, Poe. I think the key question is that are we looking at this crisis in the correct context? And does it fit in that context? So if I just take a few seconds, there is a number of things we've got to do. We've got to think of what the long term is for the country in terms of what's 2050, what's net zero. What's the short-term solution to get the lights back on again now, and what's the transition path from where we are now to there? I see that the ANC the President described it, the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy described it, and the SG of the ANC described it as a project manager. It's almost a one-man show. So I see this as being a reasonable thing if his job is narrowly defined to help Eskom get around the current crisis it's got, which is different from the long-term policy which sits in DMRE and the splitting up of Eskom to allow the free market to function in parallel with the state going forward. So they can make some sense. I fear, however, and it's an opposite, you've now got three ministers who will probably have an argument, because it seems to be the way these things work. And you've also got a situation where you've got a minister appointed almost as a pseudo replacement for the Eskom board and the Eskom CEO. So I don't know how they're going to manage the relationship between the new minister, the Eskom board, and the new Eskom, well, the present Eskom CEO and the new Eskom CEO.
Could
that, if they can define it,
could that itself, pardon me, not be where the clashing point will come and then result in not much being done and implemented because of the clash?
That's a question of always personalities and definition of roles. My experience is that you've got to really define roles. When you've got this kind of thing, you've got to define the roles very carefully. And if I have a worry about the Minister of Electricity, it is he going to just be the project manager and be the oversight function over the board and the CEO, or is he going to try and be almost doing the board and the CEO's job, in which case there will be a very interesting fiduciary debate about who's accountable for what. Never mind the discussion between public enterprises who are the accounting authority for Eskom and therefore legally obliged to be the oversight authority for Eskom. So Eskom's now going to have two oversight bodies, that's the two ministers, and also a policy coming from a third place. So if you can get those ministers to work together sensibly and have a sensible, as I said, sensible short-term plan, get Eskom working. Sensible long-term plan, zero carbon by 2050 ends up, and I'll be biased, as largely a nuclear solution, because I hear people talking about Medupi and Kusile running beyond 2050. Well, in a net zero carbon world, you can't have Medupi and Kusile running. You can't have gas. You end up with only hydro or big nuclear, and those are the things you end up with. And in the meantime, what do we do to get from where we are now to the 2050 date? And that's quite an important discussion. But that's three different discussions. And I think that the Minister of Electricity, if his job is to provide whatever support Eskom thinks it needs in terms of the state of disaster, whatever that means, and I'm always wary, I'm not a lawyer, I don't quite understand what these things are, but I think that's a viable situation. What's interesting, of course, is that the key thing that the Eskom needs now for the next 5 years, fix the problem the next year, but over the next few years, the key thing is to allow it to get waivers to the emissions requirement, which is currently closing down its stations. So Eskom just closed down Komati, which is a 1,000 megawatt station, largely because of emission standards and agreement with the Department of Environmental Affairs, or Fisheries, Forestry and Environmental Affairs. My view is that you shouldn't be shutting down stations. They may not be reliable, they may not be the best stations in the universe, they may not be the cheapest stations to run, but they are stations that make power on demand. And the biggest fear I would have is that over the next 5 years, we'll be shutting down a series of big coal stations with nothing actually replacing them. We've got to push their life out as long as we can. It's like running an old motor car. It isn't the best thing to run, but it still works.
I suppose also the other standout announcement was from last night's address with President Cyril Ramaphosa's State of the Nation was South Africa's energy crisis as a national state of disaster. How do you think that will pan out? Because already there are fears that looting could occur and abuse. South Africans could suffer abuse. What are your thoughts around that?
I think we've got to separate two things out. What is the intent, assuming there's and what should it do, and clearly how do you manage it to avoid financial irregularities? And quite simply, there are, I said, there's two things that is currently hurting Eskom, I believe, at the moment. And one was there when I was there, which is quite simply the time it can take to get approval for major contracts. You can see it now. There was a contract Eskom's got to maintain its boilers. And the court has thrown this out for reasons that I think are slightly specious, but I'm not sure. And so you've got this continual battle of getting the contracts in place, and they're big contracts. And in many cases, it isn't simply a money issue, it's also a competency issue. So that's the one thing it can do. And the other thing it can do, and that will presumably the disaster will allow that to be some of the PFMA requirements to be adjusted, but they could be adjusted anyway by the Minister of Finance because the Act allows that. So I'm not quite, it certainly will make that easier, but it will still be there. The other one is clearly, as I said earlier, is the environmental constraints. One of the key issues now for Eskom is to get Kasili 1, 2 and 3 back into service. And they're trying to build temporary stacks because the exhaust stacks have failed. And they need a waiver from the Department of Environmental Affairs to bypass their DSOX equipment, the desulfur dioxide equipment, which they've got installed. Only station in the country to have it. Is that kind of thing. We've got to recognise that, so I think there could be value in that. The problem clearly is that as soon as you give almost unlimited power by edict, you're in danger of some kind of things going wrong. And that's just a question of controlling it. I'm not sure the AGSA really has the capacity. They're pretty heavy loaded doing the audits of all the state organs as well. So I think it has some logic to it, but I'm not sure it couldn't have been achieved without that logic if the cabinet was all of one mind, because the law does allow the ministers in these cases to give the waivers, but it also will avoid the court cases, which have now become a South African fashion, which is anything that one puts forward, you have a court case against it. And some of those court cases are highly politically seen as good ideas, like the whole car power ship issue, which in fact, in my view, have little basis. The court cases have not got any serious merit behind them, but they stop the process. So that's the problem we've got now. You literally got team I saw news today, there was a team that went over to Europe to play the European Parliament to stop Total from doing its investigations of natural gas off the coast of South Africa. Not sure that's in the national interest is a good thing, in the sense that we need energy.
A lot of the questions have also come around the car power ship deal and the time frame, a 20-year time frame. Some civic organizations have been questioning that, and that in itself leaves room for a lot of suspicion.
Yeah, but that's always amuses me. The state went out for 2 open tenders at the same time. One was the risk mitigation IPP program, one was the renewable energy IPP program, bid window 5 or whatever. They had a standard set of rules in both of them, and they both offered a 20-year PPA. In the case of the risk mitigation, it said, we do not care how you make the power, just make power that's dispatchable. Right? And that was largely won by the car power ship as the most competitive option on the table. It did, of course, mean and this is the problem with the car power ships, I think, is that it comes as a block from overseas. And it means there are no local deals to be made to extract my rent from. And so there's a big complaint about it because it was getting in the way of I'll say, domestically developed projects that would have yielded more money for domestic deal makers. What's also interesting in that, by the way, is at the same time, with the same economic situation in the world, the renewable energy prices came in extremely good at about 40 cents a unit. The risk mitigation, which actually had performance figures, in other words, it had to make power for 18 hours a day, came in at over 4 times the price of the renewable energy option, which didn't have any, which is a take or pay contract. So it does show you the difference between classical renewable costs and usable costs by the industry. But the 20 years was there because that was the terms of the tender that went out for everybody. People are complaining, and I understand they're now talking of a 10-year period. But the present indications are that when you think about it, all the car power ship is a natural gas-fired power plant fed by LNG imported by ship. So it's no different to building a gas turbine on the land and feeding it from which everyone else is talking about. So I think it's more to do with the money flow does not go into the right pockets in the car power deal. It ends up being essentially a one-stop deal.
Yeah.
Whereas the local deals ended up with deal making and finance raising and everything else locally, which got to good margins for some local entrepreneurs.
Very well. Thank you so much, David Nicholls. Thanks for your time.